It was Christmas Eve. We drove to my stepdaughter's house for dinner. My wife walked through the front door first. The moment I stepped in behind her, my stepdaughter blocked the doorway. "Get out. You were never invited." I started to speak. My wife turned to me. "She's not your daughter. Don't. She needs a real father." I looked past them both. A man I recognized was sitting inside holding a glass of wine, smiling at me like he had already won. I nodded once. "Okay," I said. "Your choice." 30 minutes after I walked out, they started calling. "Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I appreciate your support more than words can say. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? Let me know in the comments." Please note, some fictional elements were added to this story for entertainment. Any similarity to actual names is coincidental, but the message is highly valuable. The Christmas lights on Savannah's street were the kind that blinked in sequence, one color chasing the next. Down the row of houses like something out of a holiday catalog. Red, then green, then white. Red, then green, then white. I had hung lights like that once back when Savannah was 10 years old, and decided our house needed to look like the ones she saw on television. I had climbed that ladder 3 separate times because she kept changing her mind about the pattern. Diane had stood in the driveway, laughing, holding a mug of hot chocolate, calling up directions I hadn't asked for. That was 18 years ago. I remember thinking, standing on that ladder in the December cold, that this was exactly the kind of life I had always wanted. I thought about that night during the 7-minute drive to Savannah's house on Christmas Eve. I thought about it because I was trying to hold on to something good before whatever came next. Diane sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. She hadn't spoken much since we left the apartment. I noticed she was wearing the green blouse I had ironed for her that morning, the one she always said made her look younger. She looked nice. I told her so when she came out of the bathroom, and she said thank you without looking up from the mirror. That had been the last real exchange between us since breakfast. I pulled into the driveway behind Brandon's truck. The house looked warm from the outside. Light poured through the front windows, and I could smell something cooking even from the car, something with garlic and maybe rosemary. My stomach tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain. Not hunger, something closer to dread. Diane was already opening her car door before I cut the engine. I grabbed the pie I had picked up from the bakery that morning, a pecan pie in a white box tied with red string, and followed her up the front walk. The concrete path had a crack running through it near the 3rd stepping stone. I had filled that crack with sealant back in the spring, crouched down on both knees in the afternoon heat. It had held through the summer. I noticed it was starting to open again. Diane stepped through the front door first. I was 1 step behind her pie box in hand when Savannah appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a red dress I had never seen before, hair done up in a way that looked like it had taken some effort. She looked at her mother and moved aside to let Diane pass. Then she turned to me. She did not move. "Get out," Savannah said. "You were never invited." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain needed a second to catch up with what my ears had just heard. I thought I had misunderstood her. The words were too plain, too direct, too lacking in any of the softness that people usually use when they are trying to soften something terrible. "Savannah," I said. Just her name. I did not know what else to say first. "Oh, I'm serious, Walter." She crossed her arms over her chest, and her chin lifted the way it always did when she had made up her mind about something. I had watched that chin lift 10,000 times over 20 years. When she was 12 and did not want to go to school. When she was 17 and wanted to stay out past curfew. When she was 23 and told Diane she was moving in with Brandon, whether we approved or not. "This dinner is for family. You need to leave." I looked past her into the house. The living room was lit up, the table set, candles burning. Brandon was somewhere in the back. I could hear his footsteps. And there, in my armchair, the one I had bought at the estate sale on Fletcher Avenue 11 years ago, and driven home in the back of my truck because it would not fit in the car, sat a man I recognized. Gary Cole was leaning back in that chair like he owned it. He had a glass of red wine balanced on his knee. He was looking directly at me. And he was smiling. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time for something and was now watching it happen exactly the way he had planned. My chest did something complicated. I cannot describe it as pain exactly. It was more like recognition, like the last piece of a puzzle dropping into place and realizing the picture it made was nothing like what you had expected. I started to speak. I do not know what I was going to say. Something. Anything. Diane touched my arm. I turned to look at her. She was already stepping back inside, her body half turned away from me, and she spoke without quite meeting my eyes. "She's not your daughter," Diane said. Her voice was even, measured, like she had rehearsed it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She needs a real father. Let her have this." The pie box was still in my hand. I could feel the cardboard going soft at the corner where my fingers had been gripping it too long. The garlic and rosemary smell was stronger now. Somebody's dinner, not mine. I looked at Diane for a long moment. I looked at the way she would not hold my eye. I looked at the set of her jaw and the slight tension in her shoulders, the particular way she stood when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Then I looked back at Gary Cole. He raised his glass just barely in my direction. The smile did not move. I took a slow breath. I set the pie box down on the porch railing gently because somebody had made that pie, and it was not their fault how the evening had turned out. Then I looked at Savannah, then at Diane. Then I took one more look at Gary Cole sitting in my chair drinking wine in my house on Christmas Eve. "Okay," I said. "Your choice." I turned around and walked back down the front path. Past the crack in the concrete I had filled in the spring. Past the mailbox I had installed the summer before last. Past the rose bushes along the front fence that I had planted the first year we moved in, because Diane had once mentioned, just once in passing, that she had always loved rose bushes. I got in my truck. I did not slam the door. I closed it the way I always did, with a firm pull until I felt it catch. I sat there for a moment, with both hands on the steering wheel, the engine off, looking at the Christmas lights still blinking their sequence across the front of the house. Red, green, white, red, green, white. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't go far. I only needed 30 minutes. Pete Garza lived 3 blocks from Savannah's house in a tan stucco place with a dead rose bush by the mailbox that he had been meaning to replace for 2 years. I knew this because I was the one who told him it was dead. Pete had argued with me about it for 20 minutes, insisting it was just dormant. That was Pete. He argued about everything except the things that actually mattered, and on the things that mattered, he was the most reliable man I had ever known. His porch light was on. It was always on after dark. I had called him from the driveway before I even started the engine, and he had picked up on the second ring and said nothing except, "I'll put the coffee on." That was all either of us needed. He met me at the door, still in his work clothes, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the kind of man who never fully unwound even on a holiday. He handed me a mug before I had both feet inside. "Sit down," he said. "I don't need to sit down." "Walter." He gave me the look he had been giving me for 31 years since we were both young men, working adjacent lots at a construction site in Kern County, the look that meant he was not asking. Sit down. I sat. He went to the filing cabinet in the corner of his home office, the one he kept locked, and came back with a manila folder. He set it on the table in front of me without ceremony, without speech, the way you set down a tool when somebody needs it. Inside was the loan agreement he had drafted 6 months ago, when Diane had first come to me about letting Savannah and Brandon move into the house. Pete had been the one to insist on making it formal. He had said, "I've been in real estate for 28 years. Walter and I have never once seen a handshake arrangement end well between family members." He had been right, as he usually was about these things. I opened the folder and found what I was looking for immediately. Section 3, paragraph B. Owner retains full right to reclaim property upon delivery of written notice to current occupants. Minimum notice period 30 days. I had read that sentence so many times over the past few months that I could have recited it in my sleep. Inside the folder behind the contract was the notice letter. Pete had helped me draft it in early December just in case. I had hoped I would never need to use it. The envelope was already addressed, already sealed. I had signed it the week before Christmas and given it to Pete to hold because I did not trust myself not to tear it up if I kept it at home. I picked up the envelope and put it in my jacket pocket. "You sure?" Pete asked. "I was sure 3 months ago," I said. "I just kept hoping I was wrong." He nodded and refilled my coffee without asking. I sat there for about 4 minutes, long enough to let my wand stop doing the thing they had been doing since I left Savannah's driveway, that low vibration in my fingers that was not quite shaking, but was close enough to bother me. Then I picked up my phone and started making calls. The bank was first. I had set up the authorized user card for Diane 8 years ago so she could handle groceries and household expenses without us needing to coordinate every purchase. The card carried my account number. My name was the primary. Canceling it took one phone call, 4 minutes, and my social security number. The representative on the line had a cheerful voice that did not match the occasion. She told me the card would be deactivated within minutes and wished me a happy holiday. I thanked her and hung up. Internet was next. I had the account number memorized because I was the one who paid the bill every month. The automated system at the cable provider walked me through the cancellation in under 3 minutes. Service termination, it informed me in a pleasant, recorded voice, would take effect immediately for non-essential services, including wireless internet and streaming packages. I pressed the confirmation number and ended the call. I thought about Savannah for a moment. She had been in the middle of posting something on Instagram when I pulled up to the house. I had seen the ring light through the front window, the pale glow of it behind the curtain. She had been live streaming. Whatever her friends were watching right now, the signal had just gone dark. Cable television was the third call. Also under my name, also paid from my account. Also canceled without complication. The customer service representative tried to offer me a discounted rate to stay. I said no thank you and meant it. Then I called my insurance provider and removed Savannah's vehicle from the policy. I had been carrying her car on my plan since she was 22, when she had gotten into a minor accident, and her own rate had gone up so high, she said she could not afford it. I had added her without making her feel bad about it, because that was what I did. The agent confirmed the removal and told me Savannah would receive a notification by text within the hour. I set the phone down on Pete's kitchen table and picked up my coffee. Pete was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching me with the particular expression he wore when he was working something out. "She's going to call you," he said. "I know. Both of them will." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside somewhere down the street, a car horn sounded twice and then someone laughed. The kind of open, unguarded laugh that belonged to people who were having the kind of Christmas Eve I had driven away from 2 hours ago in a different life. "You doing all right?" Pete asked. I thought about Gary Cole sitting in my chair. I thought about Diane's voice, measured and rehearsed, telling me not to make things harder than they needed to bomb. I thought about Savannah's chin lifted, certain the door not moving an inch. Not particularly, I said, but I will be. My phone lit up on the table. Diane's name on the screen. Then it went dark. Then it lit up again. Then Savannah. Then Diane once more. I turned the phone face down and finished my coffee. I found out what happened inside that house in pieces over the following days, from Brandon mostly, and from Kyle, and once from Denise Harper, who had heard enough from Savannah at work to fill in the parts the others had missed. I put it together the way you put together anything you were not there to see carefully, and with the understanding that every person who tells you a story tells you their version of it. But the broad shape of it, the sequence of events, I am confident in. It went like this. The Wi-Fi died first. Savannah was midway through a video she had been recording for the past 20 minutes, something about the holiday table setting the candles and the good dishes and the centerpiece she had ordered online in November. She had the ring light angled just right and had been talking to the camera in the easy, practiced way she had developed over the past year of posting regularly. Her friends were watching. Some of them were commenting in real time. And then the signal dropped, the little icon in the corner of her phone went gray, and the screen froze on her own face mid-sentence. She tried to reset the router. She unplugged it and counted to 30 and plugged it back in the way she always did when the internet went slow. Nothing came back. She tried her phone's cellular data and got a connection weak but functional, and that was when she realized the Wi-Fi was not having an outage. The Wi-Fi had been turned off, not by a glitch, by a person. She called me. I did not answer. Diane was in the kitchen finishing the gravy when her phone buzzed with a text from the grocery store. She had run out to Ralph's 20 minutes before Walter and I had arrived to pick up a few things she had forgotten: extra dinner rolls, a can of cranberry sauce, a bottle of sparkling cider. She had paid with the card that had my name on it. The text informed her that the transaction had been flagged and reversed, which was the store's way of saying the payment had failed after the fact, and that she needed to return to the store or contact her bank. Diane called the number on the back of the card and was informed in a courteous and completely final way that the card had been deactivated by the primary account holder. She told me later that she stood in the kitchen for a full minute, just holding the phone against her ear after the call ended, listening to the silence on the line. The gravy burned a little at the edges of the pan while she stood there. She didn't notice until she smelled it. Rosa Vega, the cashier who had processed Diane's order, called personally to let her know that the items were being held at the customer service desk, and that she had until closing time to either pay in cash or return the goods. Rosa was polite about it. She always was, apparently. But she made the call from the store phone, which meant the number showed up on Diane's screen as Ralph's Grocery and Savannah saw it when she walked into the kitchen to complain about the internet, and noticed her mother staring at the phone like it had said something she could not process. Gary was still in his living room. He had refilled his glass at some point and moved from the armchair to the couch, stretching out with the ease of a man who has decided a place suits him. Brandon came in from checking on something in the garage and found him there, and did not say anything, because Brandon was the kind of man who avoided confrontation the way some people avoid bad weather by simply waiting for it to pass. Gary heard the noise from the kitchen, Diane's voice going up, Savannah's voice answering the particular pitch that enters a room when two people are frightened and trying not to show it to each other. He set his glass down on the coffee table on the wood without a coaster and got up. He found them in the kitchen. Diane explained what had happened with the card in short clipped sentences, and Gary listened with his arms crossed and his expression doing something careful and calculating that Savannah would only recognize later for what it was. He said he needed to use the restroom and went down the hallway. What he actually did, according to Brandon, who pieced it together from what he saw and what went missing, is go into the bedroom where the coats were piled on the bed. Diane's coat was on top. Gary went through the pockets. He was looking for cash or a separate card or anything that suggested the situation was less dire than it appeared. What he found instead was a folded piece of paper in the inside pocket. A letter. Handwritten 2 pages Walter's penmanship, which was the careful block printing of a man who had learned to write legibly because his work required it. Gary read it. I do not know how long it took him. Long enough. He came back to the kitchen and told Diane and Savannah that he had left something in his car and would be right back. He was not right back. Savannah called his cell phone 4 minutes later. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Same result. She sent a text that said, "Call me," and watched the screen for the 2 gray check marks that meant it had been delivered, and they appeared, and then nothing else did. Gary Cole's car was gone from the curb. Savannah stood at the front window with her phone pressed against her sternum, and her face doing something that Brandon described as very still and very young, the face of someone who has just understood something they had been avoiding understanding for a long time. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. Her free hand found the curtain and gripped it hard enough that the rod shifted slightly on its bracket. "He's not coming back," she said. It was not a question. Diane did not answer her. Diane was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, staring at the burned gravy on the stove, and she looked for the first time that evening like a woman who understood exactly what she had done. Brandon Cole was not a complicated man. He worked 40 hours a week at the Amazon fulfillment center on the south side of Bakersfield, drove a truck he had bought used, and maintained himself and cooked exactly 3 things: well-scrambled eggs, chili, and a pasta dish his mother had taught him, that he refused to write down because he said the whole point was doing it from memory. He had been with Savannah for 4 years and married to her for 2. He had liked me from the beginning, or at least he had told me so, and in my experience, Brandon Cole did not say things he did not mean. Kyle Merritt told me most of what happened that night. Kyle was Brandon's oldest friend, the kind of friend who had been there since junior high and never required explanation or context, the kind you called at 10:30 on Christmas Eve without preamble and knew he would come. Kyle drove a blue Silverado and lived 12 minutes away, and he told me the story 3 weeks later over coffee at a diner on Chester Avenue, leaning forward, with his elbows on the table, speaking carefully, like a man who understood he was handing me something fragile. Brandon had been in the garage when the Wi-Fi went out. He was looking for an extension cord he thought he'd left there on his last visit, moving through the shelving, along the back wall, when he heard the noise from inside the house rise in pitch and frequency. He recognized the particular quality of it. It was not the noise of a party encountering a minor problem. It was the noise of a situation becoming something else entirely. He came back inside through the kitchen door and found Diane on the phone and Savannah pacing the length of the living room with her arms crossed over her chest, her heels making sharp contact with the hardwood floor on every step. Gary was nowhere he could see. He asked what had happened. Savannah told him about the card, about the Wi-Fi. She told him quickly in the compressed way she spoke when she was frightened and did not want to appear frightened, her sentences running together without pauses. Brandon listened. He asked where Gary was. Savannah said he went to get something from his car. Brandon went to the front window and looked out at the street. Gary's car was gone. He stood at the window for a moment, and then he went back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway, watching Savannah, who had picked up her phone again and was calling Gary for what Kyle said was the 3rd or 4th time by then. Her face was tight and bright, and she was holding the phone so hard her knuckles had gone pale. And then Diane, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, said something that Kyle told me Brandon had repeated to him word for word. The way you repeat something, you need someone else to hear in order to believe it yourself. Diane said quietly, almost to herself, "Don't worry about it. Once we get this sorted out, the house situation will work itself out. Walter can't actually do anything. That house is as good as ours." Brandon looked at Diane. He looked at Savannah, who did not contradict her mother, who actually nodded just slightly, just once, with the distracted certainty of someone agreeing with something they had always believed. He told Kyle later that it was not anger he felt in that moment. It was something quieter and more final than anger. It was the feeling of a door closing. He went to the bedroom. He took his duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet, and he packed it the way he packed for overnight shifts, efficiently and without sentiment. 2 changes of clothes, his phone charger, his wallet, his keys. Savannah appeared in the doorway before he had zipped the bag shut. "What are you doing?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "I'm going to my mom's." "Brandon." She stepped into the room. "It's Christmas Eve." "I know what day it is. You can't just leave." She reached for his arm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't stop packing either. "We can fix this. We just need to call Walter, explain that things got out of hand, and he'll..." "He'll what, Savannah?" Brandon looked at her, then really looked at her, and Kyle said that when Brandon described the moment, his voice had gone flat and tired, in a way that was worse than shouting. "You stood at that door, and you told him to leave. Your mother told him his own daughter wasn't his, and now you want me to call him and ask him to fix things for you." Savannah's eyes filled. "That's not fair. Your mom just said the house is as good as yours." He zipped the bag. "Walter's been paying the mortgage on that house since before you were in high school. He fixed the roof. He planted those roses out front. And tonight, you told him to get out." He picked up the bag. "I'm not doing this." He called Kyle from the driveway. Kyle said he'd be there in 12 minutes. Brandon sat on the front step in the December cold and did not go back inside even when Savannah opened the door and said his name twice in a row, in the particular way that had always worked on him before. He looked at his shoes. He waited. Kyle pulled up at 10:47. Brandon got in without looking back at the house. He told Kyle he felt sick to his stomach the whole drive over. Kyle told me he had said she'll come around. Brandon had looked out the passenger window at the Christmas lights on the houses they were passing and said, "I don't think that's the point anymore." I left Pete's house at 11:15 and drove without a destination for a while, which was not something I had done since I was a younger man. And restlessness still felt like a reasonable response to things I could not solve. Bakersfield, at night on Christmas Eve, is quieter than you would expect for a city its size. Most of the lights were still on in the houses I passed, warm rectangles of yellow behind curtains, the occasional flicker of a television. I passed a family of 4 loading into a minivan in their driveway. The kids in pajamas, the parents moving with the efficient exhaustion of people who had been awake since before sunrise. I passed a gas station with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Open Christmas, God bless." I passed the elementary school where I had once fixed a faulty outlet in the gymnasium as a favor to the principal, who had been a neighbor of ours for 3 years before she moved. I drove past 3 churches before I stopped at the 4th one. Grace Community Church on Union Avenue was a modest building. White paint, a simple wooden cross, above the double doors. The kind of church that did not try to impress anyone with its architecture, because the people who attended it had decided long ago that was not the point. The parking lot was mostly empty. The Christmas Eve service had ended hours earlier, but the lights inside were still on, and I could see movement through the narrow windows flanking the entrance. I sat in the truck for a few minutes. The heat was running and the radio was off, and the only sound was the engine and my own breathing, which was steadier than I would have expected given the evening I had just come through. I had cried exactly once in the past 4 hours briefly in Pete's driveway before I started the car, the kind of crying that is more about pressure releasing than grief arriving. The grief I knew would come later and more slowly, the way it always did. Glenn Morris had been the pastor at Grace Community for 11 years. I had been attending irregularly for 9 of those years, the way a lot of men my age attended church, consistently enough to feel connected, infrequently enough to feel honest about my doubts. Glenn was 65 years old, heavy-set with a white beard he kept neatly trimmed and reading glasses he was always setting down somewhere and then looking for. He had buried his own wife 7 years ago and had kept showing up to that pulpit every Sunday, regardless which was the thing about him I respected most. He was stacking folding chairs in the fellowship hall when I knocked on the side door. He looked up and did not seem surprised to see me, which was either pastoral training or genuine intuition, and I had never been sure which. "Walter," he said, "come in out of the cold. I don't want to interrupt. You're not interrupting anything that matters more than this." He set the last chair against the wall and gestured toward a folding table with a coffee carafe and a plate of Christmas cookies that were mostly gone. "Sit. There's decaf left. It's not good, but it's hot." I sat. He poured 2 cups without asking and pulled a chair around to face me and sat in it, the way he sat in the front pew during his own sermons, leaning slightly forward, hands folded, giving you the impression that whatever you were about to say had his complete attention. I told him what had happened. Not all of it, not the legal details or the sequence of phone calls, but the essential shape of it. The door. Savannah's face. What Diane had said. Gary Cole in my chair with his glass of wine and that particular smile. I told it plainly without editorializing the way I would have described a repair job that had gone wrong. Here is what I found, here is what it meant, here is what I did about it. Glenn listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made him good at his job. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the floor. Then he looked at me. "Walter," he said, "when was the last time you made a decision just for yourself?" The question landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I opened my mouth and found I had no answer ready, which told me something. I had answers ready for most things. I was a man who thought ahead, who prepared, who kept folders of documents in a locked filing cabinet at his friend's house against the possibility of exactly the kind of night I had just survived. But that question caught me with nothing. "I don't remember," I said finally. Glenn nodded like that was the answer he had expected. "That's what I thought." He did not say anything else about it. He refilled my coffee and asked me where I was going to sleep, and I told him I was going to drive up to Fresno to my brother Ray's place. He said Ray was a good man. I said he was. Glenn walked me out to the parking lot and stood on the curb while I got in the truck and shook my hand through the window before I pulled out. "Call me when you get there," he said. "It's after midnight." "I'll be up," he said. "I'm always up on Christmas." I drove north on the 99 with the heat on and the radio still off. The valley was dark on both sides of the highway, the flat agricultural land that stretched out in every direction, the occasional glow of a farmhouse set far back from the road. I had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times over the years, always heading somewhere for someone else's reason. This time I was just driving. It was a small thing. It felt larger than it should have. Ray's porch light was on when I pulled into his driveway at 12:47 in the morning. He opened the door before I knocked, which meant he had heard the truck, and he stood in the doorway in his work boots and an old flannel shirt and looked at me for a moment with the particular expression that older brothers reserve for younger siblings who are in trouble, the one that holds equal parts concern. "And I told you so, and come inside right now." "Merry Christmas," he said. "Yeah," I said. He stepped back from the door. "I'll get the spare blankets." My phone had 17 missed calls by the time I turned it back over in Ray's living room. I looked at the screen long enough to see the names Diane Savannah. Diane Savannah, a number I did not recognize that might have been Gary's or might have been nobody. And then I set it face down on the coffee table and lay back on the couch and looked at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Outside, the Fresno night pressed against the windows. My chest ached in a low, persistent way that I recognized as something I would have to carry for a while before it got lighter. But underneath it, something else. Something I had not felt in long enough that it took me a moment to name it. Stillness. The smell of coffee reached me before I was fully awake. Not the weak, apologetic coffee that came out of the machine at the apartment Diane and I had been renting since Savannah and Brandon moved into the house. That coffee always tasted like it was trying not to bother anyone. This was Ray's coffee, which he made in a battered percolator he had owned since the 90s and refused to replace on the grounds that it still worked, and therefore the argument was over. It was strong enough to be impolite and hot enough to mean it, and the smell of it coming through the doorway of Ray's spare room was the first thing that had felt genuinely familiar in the past 12 hours. I sat up on the couch. Ray had left a folded wool blanket on the armrest the night before the green one that had been in the family since I could remember, the one our mother used to put over us when we fell asleep watching television as kids. I did not know if Ray had chosen it deliberately or just grabbed the nearest one. With Ray, it could have been either. He was standing at the kitchen counter when I came in, pouring 2 mugs with the careful attention he gave to most things he considered worth doing right. His kitchen was the kind that accumulated evidence of a life: a shelf of mismatched mugs, a pegboard of tools above the back door, a calendar from a local lumberyard with the current week circled in red marker, a coffee can on the windowsill that held pencils and a folding knife, and 3 things that were not pencils or knives. "Merry Christmas," I said. "You already said that last night." He handed me a mug. "I told you I'd get the blankets." We sat at the kitchen table. Outside the window, Ray's backyard was pale and still, the dormant vegetable garden he kept along the back fence, the woodpile stacked under the overhang of the workshop, the bare branches of the persimmon tree he had planted 12 years ago that now produced more fruit than he could use, and so he left boxes of it on the front porch for the neighbors every October. We drank our coffee. Ray did not ask me to explain anything I had already told him on the phone. He did not offer opinions about Diane or Savannah or what I should do next. He drank his coffee and looked out at the backyard with the settled patience of a man who had learned that most things became clearer if you gave them enough room. After a while, he said, "I want to show you something." "I want to show." He went to the back bedroom and came back with an old Samsung phone in a cracked case, the screen worn at the corners. He set it on the table between us and looked at it for a moment before he picked it up. "Mom's old phone," he said. "I charge it up every couple months. I don't know why exactly. Habit, I guess." He navigated to the video gallery with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before and knew where he was going. He turned the phone toward me and pressed play. The video was grainy in the way phone cameras were grainy in 2016. The color slightly warm, the framing slightly off-center, the way a 16-year-old's framing always was. It had been shot in the dining room of the house on Morella Way. I recognized the wallpaper behind the table, the same pale yellow stripe I had put up the spring before, because Savannah had picked it out of a catalog and circled it with a marker and left the catalog on the kitchen counter where I would find it. Our mother was sitting at the head of the table. She was wearing the blue cardigan she wore to everything she considered an occasion. There was a birthday cake in front of her white frosting, and she was laughing at something someone off camera had said, her whole face involved in it, the way her face always was when she laughed. Then the camera swung to the left just briefly and caught me standing in the kitchen doorway. I was younger by 9 years, heavier in the face, wearing the green Henley I had owned for too long. I was holding a dish towel and grinning at something, and I do not know how else to say this. I looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. The camera swung back to our mother. Then Savannah's voice came through the speaker, young and clear, the voice she had before it acquired its adult edges. "Okay, Grandma, make a wish. And tell Uncle Walter he's the best dad I ever had." Our mother looked up toward the camera and laughed again. "Tell him yourself, sweetheart. He knows." A pause. The cake candles flickered. "He knows." Ray pressed stop. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a scrub jay landed on the woodpile and sat there for a moment, its blue shoulders sharp against the pale wood, and then flew off. The percolator on the counter ticked as it cooled. My throat had closed in a way that made speaking inadvisable. I set my mug down carefully on the table because my hands had developed an opinion about the situation that I had not asked for. I looked at the phone screen, now dark, and then at the window, and then at my hands. Ray did not say anything consoling. He did not tell me it was going to be all right, or that Savannah had meant it, or that people could change. He was not that kind of man, and I was grateful for it. He just sat across from me and drank his coffee and let the silence be what it was, which was not empty but full of 9 years of Sunday mornings and birthday cakes, and a 16-year-old girl's voice saying, "He knows. He knows," like it was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. After a long while I said, "She meant it then." Ray turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. "Yeah," he said. "She did." I nodded. I picked up my coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. "I'm not going to cut her off completely," I said. It surprised me a little saying it out loud. I had not decided it consciously, but there it was already decided the way certain things are decided before you know you've decided them. Ray looked at me. "Okay, that doesn't mean things go back to how they were." "I know that," he said. "So does she, even if she doesn't know it yet." I turned toward the window. The persimmon tree's bare branches made a dark pattern against the gray December sky, complicated and exact the way things that have been growing for a long time tend to look. Ray's backyard, Ray's tree, Ray's coffee, still too strong and still the best thing I had tasted in recent memory. My phone was on the coffee table in the other room. I had not looked at it since the night before. I knew what was on it. I was not ready to deal with what was on it. That was all right. For the first time in a long time, I had the space to decide when I was ready, and I did not have to explain that to anyone. Ray went out to the workshop after breakfast the way he did every morning, regardless of the day or the season, because Ray was the kind of man who needed to make something with his hands before noon or the rest of the day felt unmoored. I heard the table saw start up through the kitchen wall, a clean, steady whine, and then settle into the particular rhythm he used when he was cutting something that required patience. I stayed at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and looked at the persimmon tree and let my mind do what it had been trying to do since the night before, which was go back. People ask me why I stayed as long as I did. Not out loud, usually. But I have seen the question on faces in the particular way people go careful and neutral when the subject of Diane comes up, the way they choose their words. I never had a simple answer. The honest answer required going back to the beginning, and the beginning was not a dramatic story. It was just a Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot in 2002, which is where things that change your life usually start, not in moments designed for significance, but in the spaces between errands. Diane was trying to get a shopping cart out of the return corral. The wheel was jammed. She was yanking at it with the focused frustration of a woman who did not have time for this particular problem. And there was a little girl sitting on the curb nearby, maybe 6 years old, watching her mother with an expression of solemn patience that looked borrowed from someone much older. The little girl had Diane's dark hair and was wearing a jacket that was slightly too small, the cuffs ending an inch above her wrists. I freed the cart. It took about 4 seconds. Diane looked at me like I had done something requiring explanation. "Thank you," she said, in the tone people use when they are grateful, and also slightly annoyed at needing to be grateful. The little girl stood up from the curb and took her mother's hand. She looked at me with direct, assessing eyes, the kind children have before they learn to look sideways at things. "That's Savannah," Diane said, as if I had asked. I crouched down to be at eye level. "Hi, Savannah." She looked at me for a long moment. "Hi," she said. Then she looked at her mother. "Can we get the cereal with the rabbit on it?" That was how it started. I did not intend to fall in love with Diane. I was 40 years old and had decided not bitterly, but practically, that my life had taken its shape, and the shape did not include a family. I owned a small house in East Bakersfield that I had bought 3 years earlier when interest rates were low, and everyone told me a single man had no business buying that much house on an electrician's salary. I had ignored them, which was not unusual for me. The house needed work, and I liked work that I could see the result of at the end of the day. Diane was 38 and exhausted in a way that had become structural, built into how she held her shoulders, and how she ordered her coffee, and how she answered questions about herself with other questions. She was working 2 jobs, then a receptionist position at a dentist's office during the day, and a few nights a week at a restaurant on Oak Street, where she said the tips were inconsistent, and the kitchen was always 20 degrees too hot. She had been on her own with Savannah since the girl was 3 years old, when Gary Cole had left for reasons that were numerous, and none of them good. She did not talk about Gary much in those early years, which I respected. Some things do not need to be explained. They only need to be survived. I did not try to be Savannah's father. That was not a strategy. It was simply the truth of what I understood my position to be. She already had a father, technically, somewhere, a man whose absence she had learned to treat, as a fact of her landscape, the way you learn to treat a gap in a fence, you know. It's there, you navigate around it, and on most days, you don't think about it too hard. I was not trying to fill that gap. I was just another adult in the room, one who happened to show up consistently and fix things when they broke and not require very much in return. We married in the spring of 2005. Savannah was 8 years old and wore a dress she had chosen herself, pale blue, and stood beside her mother at the front of the church with the serious expression she wore for occasions she had decided mattered. I moved my tools into the house on Morella Way the week before the wedding. It was a 4-bedroom colonial that I had put the down payment on with money I had been saving since my late 20s every month, a small amount into an account I did not touch. Diane cried when I told her the house was in my name alone. Not from disappointment, I think, but from some kind of relief she had not known she was waiting to feel. She said, "You actually did it." I did not know exactly what she meant, but I said yes, and she laughed, and that was enough for both of us. What followed were years that I can only describe as ordinary in the best possible sense of that word. I drove Savannah to school in the mornings when Diane worked early shifts. I taught her to ride a bicycle in the driveway, running alongside her until she told me to let go, and then watching her wobble and correct and wobble and correct until the corrections became automatic. I attended every school play she was in, including the 4th grade production of Something About Pilgrims that lasted 45 minutes longer than it should have, and in which Savannah played a rock. She stopped calling me Dad sometime around her 15th birthday. I noticed but did not mention it. It became Walter. I answered to it the same way I had always answered to the other thing without making it mean more than it was. She was a teenager. Teenagers renegotiate everything. I was not going anywhere regardless of what she called me. What I did not understand then, sitting at Ray's kitchen table on Christmas morning, with the table saw running in the workshop, and the persimmon tree bare against the sky, was that my willingness to stay regardless had not been received as love. It had been received as permanence taken for granted. There is a difference. It took me 20 years and one Christmas Eve to learn it. I finished my coffee. The table saw stopped. Ray's boots on the workshop floor, a door closing. The ordinary sounds of a morning that belonged entirely to itself. I got up and rinsed my mug in the sink and looked out the window at the backyard and thought about what it meant to have spent 20 years building something in someone else's name without ever quite saying out loud that the building itself was mine. I knew Gary Cole was back before Diane ever said a word about it. Jimmy Carroll told me. Jimmy ran the corner grocery on Niles Street, a narrow store with good produce and bad lighting that had been in his family since his father opened it in 1987. He was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the deliberate manner of a man who had spent decades watching the neighborhood change around him and had formed opinions about most of it. He extended credit to people he trusted and posted their "I owe us" on a corkboard behind the register without embarrassment, which was either an act of community service or a very public record of who owed him money, depending on how you looked at it. I had known Jimmy for 15 years. He knew my coffee order, the make and model of my truck, and the names of every member of my family, which he used with the comfortable familiarity of a man who considered knowing your neighbors a professional obligation. It was a Thursday morning in October, and I had stopped in for coffee before a job on the east side. Jimmy was restocking the shelves near the front window when I came in, and he looked up and said without preamble, "Your wife's ex-husband is back." I stopped with my hand on the coffee carafe. "Gary Cole," Jimmy said, as if I might have needed the clarification. "He's renting a room over on Pacheco. Been coming in here every 2 or 3 days." He set a can of soup on the shelf with the particular care of a man choosing his words at the same time. "Bought 2 bottles of bourbon last week and put them on a tab. I told him I don't run tabs for people I don't know." He paused. He said Diane would cover it. I poured my coffee. I put the lid on. I paid for it. "Thanks, Jimmy," I said. "Yeah," he said. He looked at me directly the way he did when he had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. He's got the look of a man who came back because he ran out of better options. You know that look. I knew that look. I drove to the job on the east side and did the work and drove home and did not say anything to Diane that evening. I watched her instead the way you watch something when you already suspect what you are looking at and are simply waiting for the evidence to arrange itself into a shape you cannot argue with. It arranged itself within 2 weeks. The checking account we shared for household expenses began showing withdrawals I did not recognize. Not large amounts. $60 here, $40 there, the kind of withdrawals that were small enough to seem like nothing and frequent enough to add up to something. I went back through 3 months of statements on a Sunday afternoon, while Diane was at her sister's sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator, adding the numbers in the way I had added numbers my entire working life carefully, without hoping for a particular result. The total over 3 months was $840. I sat with that number for a while. Then I called Pete. He came over the following Tuesday evening, and we sat at the kitchen table with the statements spread between us and 2 cups of coffee going cold at our elbows. Pete looked at the numbers with the expression he used for things that were worse than he had expected, but not worse than he had prepared for. "You want to get a lawyer?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want to get the paperwork right first." He nodded. He understood what I meant. Pete had been in real estate long enough to know that the paperwork was almost always the thing that most disputes between people who had once loved each other came down in the end not to who was right, but to who had thought to write things down. We spent the next hour going over the loan agreement he had drafted in June, the one Savannah and Brandon had signed when they moved into the house. Pete walked me through Section 3, Paragraph B, with the patience of a man who had explained legal documents to people in distress many times before. Owner retains full right to reclaim property upon delivery of written notice. Minimum notice period 30 days. "You could move on this now," Pete said. "I know. But you're not going to." "Not yet." I folded the statement and put it in my jacket pocket. "I want to give it until Christmas." Pete looked at me over his reading glasses. "Why Christmas?" I thought about it. About Diane setting the table with the good dishes she only used for holidays. About Savannah's voice on that phone years ago telling a birthday cake to tell me I was the best dad she ever had. About 20 years of Decembers in that house, the smell of pine and pecan pie, the lights on the porch that were never quite straight. Because if things are going to change, I said, I want to know they actually can, before I decide they can't. Pete took off his reading glasses and cleaned them with his shirt. "That's either very generous or very foolish." "Probably both," I said. He put his glasses back on. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. "I'll keep the contract at my place," he said. "You call me when you need it." "I know." He left at 9:30. I sat at the kitchen table after he was gone and looked at the yellow legal pad with its column of numbers and thought about Gary Cole in a rented room on Pacheco Street, putting bourbon on a tab in my wife's name, waiting to see what she would do about it. I thought about what Jimmy Carroll had said. He's got the look of a man who came back because he ran out of better options. I had been generous for 20 years. I was beginning to understand that generosity and foolishness were not always as different as I had wanted them to be. 3 weeks before Christmas, Savannah called and asked if I could come by the house and look at an outlet in the kitchen that had stopped working. The microwave and the coffee maker were both on the same circuit, she said, and every time she ran them at the same time, the breaker tripped. I told her I would come by Saturday morning. This was the kind of call I had been getting for 18 years. Not just from Savannah, from Diane's sister, from neighbors, from people at church who had my number and knew I would not charge them for a small job. I did not mind it. Electrical work was what I knew, and knowing something useful and sharing it freely was not something I had ever needed to think carefully about. It was just how I was built. I arrived at 8:30 on a Saturday with my tool bag and a replacement outlet I had picked up from the hardware store the evening before. Brandon answered the door in a gray sweatshirt, hair still damp, coffee in hand. He looked tired in the low-grade chronic way of a man running a schedule that did not leave much room for rest. He thanked me for coming and showed me to the kitchen and said Savannah was still asleep, and then excused himself to shower. The outlet was a straightforward fix. The connection behind the faceplate had worked loose over time, which was common in houses of that age, and the repair took me 20 minutes, including the time I spent checking the adjacent outlets to make sure the issue was isolated. I replaced the outlet reset, the breaker, tested the microwave and the coffee maker together, and wrote down the breaker box location on a piece of paper I left on the counter, because Savannah had asked me twice in the past year where it was. I was putting my tools back in the bag when Brandon's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was not trying to read it. The screen was facing up and I was standing 18 inches away, and the notification appeared in the banner at the top of the display the way notifications do, large enough to be legible without effort. I saw it the way you see something written on a sign you happen to be standing near, without intending to, without being able to unsee it once you had. The group chat was named Mom and Savvy with a Christmas tree after it. The message was from Diane. It said, "Has he confirmed he's coming Christmas Eve? We need to know for the seating." I stood very still with my tool bag in my hand. The phone lit up again. Savannah's name this time. It said yes. 6 o'clock. I already told him which chair. I looked at that message for what was probably 5 seconds and felt like considerably longer. The chair. My chair. The one I had bought at the estate sale on Fletcher Avenue. The one Gary Cole had been sitting in when I looked through the front door on Christmas Eve 3 weeks later. They had planned it. Not in the impulsive, careless way that people do hurtful things when they are not thinking clearly. They had planned it the way you plan an event, with confirmed arrival times and seating assignments. I put the last tool in the bag and zipped it closed. Brandon came back into the kitchen while I was washing my hands at the sink. He was dressed now, the sweatshirt replaced with a work shirt, his hair combed. He looked at the outlet and then at me. "All fixed," he said. "All fixed," I said. "Should hold fine now." He picked up his phone from the counter and slipped it into his pocket without looking at the screen. He did not know what I had seen. His face was open and uncomplicated, the face of a man who had nothing to hide because he was not hiding anything. I felt something in my chest that was adjacent to pity, but not quite that something more like sorrow for him for what I suspected he did not know about the household he was living in. "You want coffee before you go?" he said. "I just made a fresh pot." "I'm all right," I said. "Thanks, Brandon." I picked up my tool bag. I walked through the living room toward the front door. I passed the armchair on the way out. I did not look at it directly, but I was aware of it, the worn patch on the right armrest where I always rested my elbow, the slight lean to the left that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I got in my truck and drove 2 blocks and pulled over and sat there with the engine running and my hands on the steering wheel. I was not angry. That surprised me. I had expected anger had been braced for it, the way you brace for a physical impact. But what came instead was something quieter and more clarifying. It was the feeling of a thing you had suspected becoming a thing you knew. The weight of it was different from what you carried when you were only guessing. Heavier in one way, lighter in another. Because at least now there was nothing left to wonder about. I called Pete from the truck. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "It's me," I said. A pause. "How bad?" "They planned it," I said. "Confirmed times seating. They have Gary in my chair." Pete exhaled slowly. "Okay." Another pause. "You want me to draft the notice letter now?" I looked out the windshield at the street. A neighbor's kid was riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, wobbling on the turns, correcting wobbling again. The same motion, the same correction. Over and over until it became automatic. "Yes," I said, "but keep it at your place. I'm still hoping I won't need it." Pete said he would have it ready by the end of the week. I thanked him and hung up and sat there another minute before I pulled back onto the road and drove toward the highway and left that street behind me the way I had been leaving things behind me for 20 years, quietly, and without making anyone feel responsible for the leaving. 6 months before Christmas, on a Wednesday evening in June, Diane sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me she thought we should let Savannah and Brandon have the house. She had been building toward it for a while. I had felt it coming the way you feel weather changing, not in any single thing, but in the accumulation of small signs, the way she had started talking about Savannah's commute, about the neighborhood being better for starting a family, about how the apartment on the other side of town was smaller, but honestly easier to maintain. She had been arranging the argument for weeks before she made it, and by the time she sat down across from me with her hands folded on the table, she had it assembled and ready. "They don't have the money for a down payment," she said. "And the rentals in this area are ridiculous. We could move somewhere smaller, just the two of us. It would be simpler." I looked at her hands on the table. She had a habit of folding them when she was nervous, which she did not always recognize in herself. "It's my house, Diane," I said, not unkindly, just as a fact. "I know that." She met my eyes. "That's why I'm asking you." I thought about it for 3 days. I walked through the rooms in the evenings after Diane was asleep the way I sometimes did when I was working something out the kitchen, where I had retiled the backsplash one long weekend. In 2015, the hallway where I had replaced the flooring, after the water heater leaked, Savannah's old bedroom, with the pale yellow wallpaper she had picked from a catalog at age 12. 18 years of repairs and improvements that had become so woven into the structure of the place that you could not separate the house from the work without the whole thing coming apart. On the 3rd day, I called Pete. He came over on a Saturday morning, and we sat in the kitchen, and I told him what Diane had proposed. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What does she want to do about the mortgage?" he asked. "She says we'll use the joint savings to put a deposit on a rental, something smaller." "How much is in the joint savings?" $42,000. Pete wrote that down on the notepad he always carried. "And you're thinking about saying yes?" "I'm thinking about it." He tapped his pen against the notepad twice. "Then we're doing this with a proper agreement. Not a handshake, not an email, not a note on the refrigerator. A formal loan agreement with your name on it as the owner of record signed by both Savannah and Brandon, with a clause that gives you the right to reclaim the property on 30 days written notice." "She's not going to love that," I said. "She doesn't have to love it," Pete said. "She has to sign it." His daughter Carol worked for a property management firm downtown and had helped Pete with paperwork more times than either of them kept track of. She came by the following Tuesday with a draft agreement that was 4 pages long and written in the kind of clear, unambiguous language that left no room for interpretation. Pete went through it with me line by line at the kitchen table, while Carol sat at the counter with her laptop, making the 2 small changes I requested. The key provision was in Section 3, Paragraph B. Owner retains full right to reclaim property upon delivery of written notice to current occupants. Minimum notice period 30 days. Reclamation shall not require court order, provided occupants are in receipt of written notice as specified herein. That last sentence had been Carol's addition. She had said without looking up from her laptop, "Trust me, you want that in there." I had thanked her and meant it. Savannah and Brandon came to the house the following Saturday to sign. Savannah read the first page and skimmed the rest, which I noticed, but did not mention. Brandon read every page, which I also noticed, and asked one question about the notice period, which I answered directly. They signed. Pete witnessed and kept the original. I kept a copy in the filing cabinet in the bedroom. Diane had made coffee and set out a plate of cookies for the occasion, which struck me as both kind and slightly disconnected from the gravity of what we were doing. After Savannah and Brandon left, she squeezed my hand across the table and said, "Thank you for doing this. It means everything to her." "I know it does," I said. What I did not say was that I had done it partly for Savannah, and partly because 18 years of caring about someone does not disappear just because they have started treating you as furniture. And partly, if I was being honest with myself, because Pete had built into that agreement a door I could walk back through if I needed to, and having a door made the whole arrangement feel less like surrender and more like a decision I was making freely. By October, the joint savings account, had dropped from 42,000 to 31,000. There was no smaller apartment. There was no deposit paid anywhere. There were, as I had found in the bank statements spread across the kitchen table on that Sunday afternoon, $840 in cash, withdrawals at irregular intervals, each one small enough to seem unremarkable on its own. Diane had not bought us a new home. She had bought Gary Cole a place to wait. I thought about that on the drive back from Pete's office in October, the evening he confirmed what the statements already showed. I thought about the agreement sitting in his filing cabinet, the one with Carol's addition in Section 3, Paragraph B. The one Savannah had skimmed and Brandon had read carefully, and neither of them had imagined would ever actually be used. I had hoped they were right about that. Right up until the moment I wasn't hoping anymore. I came back from the flashbacks. The way you come back from them, not all at once, but in stages, the present reassembling itself around you piece by piece until you are sitting in your brother's kitchen again, with a cold cup of coffee, and the sound of the table saw running in the workshop, and the December light coming through the window, at the low angle it took this time of year. It was the morning of December 26th, the day after Christmas. Ray's kitchen calendar still showed the current week circled in red marker, the same circle from yesterday, unchanged by everything that had happened since I last looked at it. I got up and poured my coffee out, and made a fresh cup, and stood at the counter while it brewed, and thought about what came next. What came next was Carol Garza. Pete's daughter answered on the second ring, which told me she had seen my name on the screen and picked up deliberately rather than letting it go to voicemail. She was 34 years old and had her father's directness without his tendency toward long explanations, which made her efficient in the way that people who work in property management learn to be efficient, because the alternative is spending your entire day managing other people's confusion. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "how are you holding up?" "Well enough," I said. "I need a favor." "Dad called me last night," she said. "I figured you would." I asked her to pull the original file from Pete's office and make clean copies of 3 documents: the deed to the house on Morella Way, the loan agreement Savannah and Brandon had signed in June, and the notice letter I had given Savannah on Christmas Eve. I wanted copies for my own records separate from Pete's file kept somewhere only I had access to. Carol said she would have them ready by noon. While I waited, I went through my phone. There were 22 missed calls across 2 days distributed between Diane and Savannah, with 2 from a number I did not recognize that I assumed was a neighbor, or possibly Brandon calling from someone else's phone. I did not call any of them back. Instead, I opened the text messages and read them in order, starting from the first one sent at approximately 8:45 on Christmas Eve, which had been from Diane. The texts told a story in the compressed, fragmented way that texts always did, the syntax of panic, short sentences, repeated words, the same requests cycling through with increasing urgency. "Walter, please call me. Walter, the card isn't working. Walter, I need you to answer." Then later from Savannah, "You made your point. Can we please just talk about this?" Then later still, something that was not a request, but a statement. "This is not what family does." I read that last one twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and went to see if Ray needed help in the workshop. He was cutting planks for a cabinet he had been commissioned to build for a family in the north part of the city, working with the focused economy of motion that came from doing something for 30 years. I handed him boards when he needed them, and held the other end when the cut required it, and we worked together for 2 hours without talking about anything except the cabinet, which was exactly what I needed. At 11:30, my phone rang. It was Savannah. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered. She started speaking before I had the phone fully to my ear, her voice tight and rapid, the voice of someone who had rehearsed an opening and was delivering it before her nerve gave out. I need you to tell me this isn't permanent. I need you to tell me we can figure this out, because Mom is a Savannah, I said. She stopped. I'm going to read you something. I had the loan agreement open on the table in front of me, the copy I had kept in Ray's spare room since the night I arrived. I found Section 3, Paragraph B, and read it aloud slowly, and without inflection, the way I would have read a set of electrical specifications on a job site. Owner retains full right to reclaim property upon delivery of written notice to current occupants. Minimum notice period 30 days. Reclamation shall not require court order provided occupants are in receipt of written notice as specified herein. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone processing something they had not expected to be real. You gave me the notice on Christmas Eve, she said finally. Her voice had changed. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was left was something younger and more unsteady. That was the envelope. Yes. So, 30 days from Christmas Eve. January 23rd, I said. That's the date on the notice. Another silence. Longer this time. Walter. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, a small fracture that she did not try to cover. I didn't know the house was yours. I mean, I knew, but I never actually thought about what that meant. I looked out Ray's kitchen window at the persimmon tree, the bare branches, the complicated pattern they made against the sky. I know you didn't, I said. And I meant it, which was perhaps the saddest part of the whole thing. She had lived in that house for 18 years and walked past that deed in the filing cabinet and written her name on a contract that described the terms of her own tenancy, and still had not understood not really what any of it meant. Not because she was stupid, because she had never needed to think about it. Because I had made it too easy not to. What do we do? She asked. The we surprised me. Not Diane and me. Not Brandon and me. We meaning her and me, which was either a habit or something else, something that had survived the past 48 hours in spite of everything. You have 30 days, I said. Use them well. Carol called at 12:15 with the copies ready. I drove to Pete's office and picked them up and sat in the parking lot and went through them page by page in the thin December sunlight, the deed and the agreement and the notice letter with its January 23rd date typed at the top. And I thought about Savannah's voice on the phone, the fracture in it, the we. Then I put the documents in the folder, put the folder on the passenger seat, and drove back to Ray's house for lunch. Sitting in that parking lot outside Pete's office on the 26th, with the folder of documents on the passenger seat, and the engine running for heat, I found myself thinking about Dorothy Webb. I had not included her in the account of that night yet, and she deserved to be included because she was the first person who said anything to me that was not about logistics or legal strategy or what I intended to do next. She was the first person who asked about me. Dorothy Webb had lived next door to the house on Morella Way for 18 years. She was 68 years old, a retired school teacher, a widow of 6 years, and the kind of neighbor who noticed things without making you feel watched. She had seen me on that roof replacing shingles in the August heat. She had seen me in the driveway on Saturday mornings with the truck hood up. She had seen me plant the rose bushes along the front fence the first spring we moved in, crouched down in the mud, with my knees aching, working a trowel around the root ball, the way my father had shown me when I was a boy. She had said once, leaning over the fence while I was weeding, that she had never seen a man tend a garden the way I did, like the plants had feelings about being neglected. I had laughed and said they probably did. She had laughed too and gone back inside, and that had been the whole conversation, which was characteristic of Dorothy. She said what she meant and did not extend it past what was needed. On Christmas Eve, after I left Pete's house, I drove back down Morella Way before turning north toward the highway. I did not plan to stop. I was simply driving past the way you drive past things that have mattered to you slowly, and without a reason you could explain to anyone. Dorothy's front light was on. It was always on after dark. Through the front window I could see the reading lamp beside her armchair, the warm, specific yellow of it that I had seen from my own driveway on winter evenings for 18 years. She was in that chair. I could see the shape of her through the window, the white of her hair, and the angle of a book held open in her lap. I pulled over. I sat in the truck for 2 minutes arguing with myself about whether to knock. She was 68 years old, and it was nearly 11 at night on Christmas Eve, and she had not invited me and had no reason to expect me, and I was not the kind of man who showed up at a woman's door unannounced in the dark. Then I got out of the truck anyway. She answered before I finished knocking, which meant she had seen me pull up, which meant she had been watching, which meant she had probably seen me leave the house earlier that evening with my pie box still on the porch railing. She was wearing a blue robe and the reading glasses she used for small print, and she looked at me the way she always looked at me, directly, and without the slight adjustment of expression that most people performed when they were deciding how to react to something unexpected. "Walter," she said, "come in out of the cold." Her house was warm and smelled of something she had been baking earlier, cinnamon and brown sugar, and the reading lamp cast the same yellow light up close that it had looked from across the street. She brought me into the kitchen and heated soup from a pot on the stove, a thick vegetable soup that she set in front of me without asking if I wanted it, which was the right call because I would have said no, and I was hungry, in the depleted way you get hungry when your body has been managing a shock for several hours. I ate while she sat across from me with a cup of tea and did not fill the silence with words, which was the thing I needed most right then, and the thing that most people in my experience were constitutionally unable to provide. After a while, she said, "I saw you leave." I figured. I saw her stop you at the door. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been watching that house for 18 years, Walter. I know what I saw." I put my spoon down. "Dorothy, I'm not asking you to talk about it," she said. "I'm telling you what I know." She looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression I imagined she had used on students who were trying to revise their own history. "You put new gutters on that house in 2019. You repainted the trim every 3 years. You fixed my porch step last spring without me asking because you noticed it was loose." She set her mug down. "A man who does all that for a house loves the people inside it. But at some point, Walter, you have to love yourself just as much." I did not answer that. There was not an answer for it that I could produce right then. I just sat with it the way you sit with something true that you are not ready to act on yet, but cannot unhear. She refilled my soup without asking. The following morning, Kyle Merritt called Brandon from his truck to check on him, and Brandon told him what had happened in pieces, and Kyle sat in his driveway listening with his engine off and the phone pressed to his ear. And when Brandon was done, Kyle said he was going to post something on Nextdoor because people in the neighborhood deserved to know. Brandon said, "I don't know if that's a good idea." Kyle said, "I think it is." He posted it mid-morning on December 25th, a measured account of what had happened. No names except Walter's. No editorializing, just the facts arranged in the order they had occurred. By noon, it had 47 responses. By evening, it had over 200. I did not read it until Ray showed it to me on his laptop 3 days later, and when I did, I sat with it for a long time. Most of the responses were from people I did not know. Some of them had stories of their own that rhymed with mine in ways I found both comforting and unexpectedly sad. A few of them recognized the address and said things about the rose bushes and the gutters and the man they had seen working in that yard on weekend mornings for as long as they could remember. One comment near the bottom said simply, "Some people don't know what they have until it's already gone." I read that one twice. Then I closed the laptop and went to help Ray with dinner. Before I reveal the devastating aftermath inside that house and how Walter's silent trap snapped shut, comment, "Still here," so I know you're holding the line with us. And please note the following part contains some fictional elements crafted for your entertainment. If you'd prefer to skip it, feel free to stop the video right here. 30 days sounds like a long time until you are the one counting them down. I know this because Savannah told me later in the careful way she had begun to speak about that period, choosing her words, like someone navigating a room in the dark, feeling for the edges before committing her weight. She said the first week was the worst. Not because of the practical problems, though there were plenty of those, but because she kept waking up at 3 in the morning with the specific clarity that only arrives in the dark, the kind that strips away every justification you have built for yourself and leaves you with only what is actually true. What was actually true at 3 in the morning in January in the house that was not hers was this: she had stood at a door and turned away the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, attended every school play, paid her college application fees without being asked, and shown up with his tool bag every time something broke. She had done it deliberately and with planning and in front of witnesses, and she had done it for a man who had been gone before she could remember him and had come back only when he needed something and had left again the moment it was clear he would not get it. I was getting most of this from Kyle, who was getting it from Brandon, who was staying at his mother's place in the northeast part of the city, and calling Kyle most evenings to decompress in the way that men of a certain type decompressed, which was to say in brief practical exchanges that were actually about something else entirely. The first week of January, Savannah drove to the rooming house on Pacheco Street where Gary had been staying. She had not been there before. She found it without difficulty because Diane had the address written in her phone under a contact name that was not Gary, which was its own small revelation that Savannah told me she had decided not to examine too closely because she had enough to manage already. The landlord answered the door in a way that suggested he answered a lot of doors and had learned to calibrate his expression accordingly. He told her Gary Cole had cleared out on the night of December 24th, left the key on the kitchen counter, took his 2 bags, did not ask for the security deposit back. Savannah stood on that porch for a moment. The landlord waited. She thanked him and walked back to her car. She told me later she sat in the parking lot and cried for about 20 minutes, not from grief exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of finally understanding something you had been working very hard not to understand. Gary Cole had come back to Bakersfield because he was out of options and had identified a situation he thought he could use. When the situation changed, he left. He had done the same thing when she was 3 years old, and the intervening decades had not altered the essential mechanism of the man at all. Denise Harper ran the nail salon on Oak Street where Savannah had worked for 3 years. She was 45, efficient, fair-minded in the specific way of someone who had managed people long enough to stop taking their behavior personally while still holding them accountable for it. She had known Diane for years, which was how Savannah had gotten the job in the first place, and she had spent 3 of those years watching Savannah talk about Walter Hayes in the compressed, dismissive way that people talked about things they had decided not to value. She called Savannah into the back office on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of January. "I'm not firing you," Denise said before Savannah had sat down. "I want you to understand that first, but I need to say something to you, and I need you to actually hear it." Savannah sat. "I've known your mother for a long time," Denise said, "and I have watched you work here for 3 years, and in that time I have heard you talk about your stepfather in front of clients, in front of the other girls, in front of people you did not know were listening." She folded her hands on the desk. "You talked about his clothes. You talked about his truck. You made a joke once about the way he smelled when he came home from a job, and 3 clients laughed, and I watched you look pleased about it." Savannah's face had gone still. "He fixed the electrical in this salon last spring," Denise said. "The sign was flickering and I called an electrician for a quote, and the quote was $400, and then Walter came in and fixed it in 40 minutes and would not take anything for it." She looked at Savannah directly. "He did not even tell you he had done it." "I know because I thanked him, and he said please don't mention it. I have spent 8 months thinking about what kind of man says please don't mention it." Savannah did not answer. Her jaw was tight, and her hands were folded in her lap with a pressure that was visible from across the desk. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel terrible," Denise said. "You already feel terrible. I'm telling you because you are young enough for it to mean something, and because nobody else is going to say it to you this plainly." She leaned back in her chair. "You treated a good man like he was something to be embarrassed by. And the reason you did it is that you never had to think about what it would cost you, because he never made it cost you anything." Savannah told me she walked out of that office and went straight to the bathroom and stood over the sink with both hands on the counter and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, not crying, just looking. She handed in her notice the following Friday. Denise accepted it without comment, which was its own form of kindness. Brandon sent Savannah a text on January 15th, 8 days before the deadline, that said he thought they needed some time apart and that he was going to stay at his mother's for a while. He said it plainly and without anger, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Savannah called me that evening not to discuss what had happened, but because she told me later she needed to hear a voice that was not her mother's and did not know whose else to call. I answered on the 3rd ring. She said my name. I said, "I was here." We talked for 11 minutes about nothing in particular, which was, I thought afterward, its own kind of beginning. Carol Garza told me about the ring on a Thursday afternoon in late January, 3 days after the deadline had passed and Savannah and Diane had turned over the keys. She had heard it from her father, who had heard it from Dorothy Webb, who had apparently been told by the woman who worked the counter at the jewelry exchange on Chester Avenue, which was how information moved through a neighborhood of a certain size and density, not through any single channel, but through the overlapping networks of people who knew each other well enough to share things that seemed worth sharing. Carol told it to me the way she told me most things, directly and without editorializing, and then she waited to see what I would do with it. What I did with it was sit quietly for a moment, and then ask her to tell me again from the beginning. Diane had gone to the jewelry exchange on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of January. The store was on Chester Avenue, a narrow storefront between a tax preparation office and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that bought and sold gold and silver and estate jewelry without making anyone feel judged about which side of the transaction they were on. The woman behind the counter had worked there for 11 years and had seen enough of human circumstance to understand that the reasons people brought things in were usually more complicated than they appeared and did not require comment. Diane came in alone mid-morning and set the ring on the glass counter. The woman looked at it with the loop she kept on a cord around her neck and asked a few standard questions age any documentation. Diane said she did not have documentation. The woman examined the hallmark, which told her what the assay certificate would have confirmed that this was old gold, not high carat, the kind that had been common in rings made from repurposed family jewelry, in an era when people made things from what they had rather than buying new. The woman set the loop down and quoted a price. Carol said Diane stood at the counter for a long time without speaking. Long enough that the woman asked gently if she wanted a moment. Diane said no, she was fine. She just needed to think. What Diane was thinking about. I learned later from Diane herself, in the letter she sent me in February, was the afternoon I had given her the ring. We had been married at a small ceremony, fewer than 40 people, in the spring of 2005. I had not had money for a ring. That was simply the truth of my finances. At that point, I had spent what I had on the house, and what was left was what I needed to keep working, and a ring had not seemed more important than either of those things. But I had wanted to give her something that meant something, and what I had was a small amount of gold jewelry that had belonged to my mother. Pieces she had accumulated over a lifetime of modest means and occasional gifts, none of them valuable in the way that valuable usually meant, but all of them hers. I had taken them to a jeweler on Oak Street, a man named Henderson, who had been making and repairing jewelry in Bakersfield for 30 years, and who had the hands of someone who worked in small, precise things. I told him what I wanted to do. He told me what he could do with what I had. We worked it out over 2 appointments, and the result was a ring that was not impressive by conventional measure, but was made entirely from my mother's gold, which seemed to me at the time, and still seemed to me now, to be the most honest thing I could offer. Diane had cried when I put it on her finger. Not the polite, expected tears of a wedding ceremony, but something more unguarded than that. The kind of crying that takes you by surprise. She had said after she recovered herself that it was the most personal gift anyone had ever given her, and I had believed her because she was not a woman who said things she did not mean, or at least she had not been then. The woman at the jewelry exchange quoted her $40. Diane picked the ring up off the counter and put it back on her finger. Carol said the woman at the counter told her afterward that Diane had stood there for another moment, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum over the ring, and then she had thanked the woman and walked out without another word. She sat in her car in the parking lot on Chester Avenue for 40 minutes. The woman at the counter could see her through the window. She did not approach or intervene, which was the right call. Some things required witness and not assistance. When Carol finished telling me this, I was quiet for a while. "She kept it," I said finally. "She kept it," Carol said. I looked out the window of Ray's kitchen at the persimmon tree, which had begun to show the first faint suggestion of buds along its branches, small and tentative. The way things that had been dormant a long time looked when they were deciding whether it was safe to begin again. I did not know what it meant that Diane had kept the ring. I was not ready to know yet. There were too many other things that still needed to settle before I could look at that particular question and see it clearly. But I thought about my mother's hands. The way she had worn those pieces, the small gold chain, and the earrings, and the ring she had been given by her own mother, not as decoration exactly, but as a kind of record. Proof that she had been loved and had loved in return, and that these things had passed between people and been kept. I thought about what it meant to make something from what you had rather than what you wished you had, and what it meant to keep something after you had been ready to let it go. Ray came in from the workshop with sawdust on his shirt and poured himself a glass of water and looked at me the way he had been looking at me for weeks, the careful, assessing look of a man monitoring a situation without wanting to interfere with its natural resolution. "You all right?" he said. "Working on it," I said. He nodded and drank his water and went back outside, and I sat at the table with the afternoon light coming through the window and thought about gold that had passed from one set of hands to another and what it meant when someone chose not to let it go. February in Fresno was cold in the mornings and mild by afternoon, the kind of weather that could not make up its mind, and so offered a little of everything before noon. I had been at Ray's for 6 weeks by then, sleeping on the couch that had become less uncomfortable as my body adjusted to it, drinking his coffee every morning, helping in the workshop when he had more work than his hands could manage alone. It was the longest stretch of time I had spent with my brother since we were boys, sharing a bedroom in our parents' house on the east side of Bakersfield, and it turned out that we were better at being brothers in our late 50s than we had ever managed to be in our 20s, which was probably not surprising, but was still something I was grateful for. Pastor Glenn called on a Tuesday morning in early February, The way he had been calling every week or so since Christmas, not to advise or counsel, but simply to talk the way old friends talked about nothing in particular, and therefore about everything that mattered. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. "Better than I have in years," I said, and meant it. He said he was glad to hear it. He asked about Ray, about the workshop, about whether I had decided anything yet about the house. I told him Pete had listed it the previous week, with an asking price that reflected what the Bakersfield market was doing, which was moving faster than most people expected. Glenn said he would pray it went quickly. I thanked him for that and for the soup, and for the question he had asked me on Christmas Eve that I was still carrying around and turning over. "Which question?" he said. "You know which one," I said. He laughed. "I do," he said. "I hope you have an answer yet." "I'm working on it," I said. "I think the answer might be this, what I'm doing right now." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good answer," he said. The house on Morella Way sold in March. Pete called me on a Thursday afternoon with the number, and I sat in Ray's kitchen and wrote it down on the lumberyard calendar beside Ray's red-circled week because it was the nearest piece of paper. The sale closed without complication, which was what happened when a property had no liens, no disputed ownership, and a seller who had owned it outright for 20 years and simply wanted it gone. After the call, I sat for a while and thought about the house. The roof I had replaced in 2019. The kitchen backsplash from 2015. The pale yellow wallpaper in Savannah's room that had been her choice from a catalog. The rose bushes along the front fence that would be someone else's responsibility, now someone else's pleasure, in the spring when they bloomed. Someone else's minor annoyance when they needed trimming. I had built things into that house that would outlast my connection to it, which was either a loss or a legacy, depending on how you looked at it, and I had been going back and forth on that question for weeks without arriving anywhere definitive. I decided to let it be both. Pete deposited the proceeds into an account in my name alone, which was straightforward, because the property had always been in my name alone, and the uncontested divorce Diane and I had filed in February had been finalized the previous month, with a settlement that was uncomplicated by the house since the house was separate property and had never been in dispute. What remained after Pete's commission and the legal fees and the costs of 2 decades of maintenance that I chose not to try to calculate was enough to do what I had in mind and leave a reasonable amount for the years ahead. What I had in mind was the space adjacent to Ray's workshop. It had been a storage unit for 3 years, then empty for 1. Ray had been using part of it for overflow lumber, but had been talking about clearing it out since the previous summer. In April, we cleared it out together over 2 Saturdays, Ray carrying boards and me sweeping, and both of us finding things that had been in there long enough that neither of us could remember putting them there. At the end of the second Saturday, Ray stood in the empty space with his hands on his hips and looked around and said, "It's a decent size." "It is," I said. "Good light from the east window in the morning." "That's what I thought." He looked at me. "You already drew it up, didn't you?" It was not a question. I had been sketching the layout in a notebook for 3 weeks. The workbench along the south wall, the parts storage above it, the small desk in the corner for estimates and invoices. I had looked into the California business license requirements and the liability insurance and the electrician's liability coverage that a sole proprietor needed to operate independently, which was the kind of research I did quietly and thoroughly before I said anything about a plan, because the plan was real before it was announced, or it was nothing. "Hayes Electrical," Ray said, reading the notebook page I handed him. "Fresno," I said. He looked at it for another moment. Then he handed the notebook back and went to the workshop and came back with a drill and a level and a box of hardware. "Where do you want the sign?" he said. I had ordered the sign from a local printer 2 weeks earlier. It was a simple thing, white background, black letters, the name and a phone number, that was now a Fresno area code. Ray held it against the wall above the door, while I checked the level and marked the spots, and then I took the drill from him because it was my sign, and I wanted to put it up myself. The first screw went in clean. The second one caught a stud, which was good, which was what you wanted when you were hanging something you intended to keep. I stepped back and looked at it. Hayes Electrical, Fresno. Ray stood beside me with his arms crossed. "Looks right," he said. "It does," I said. Dorothy Webb called that evening from Bakersfield, as she did most weeks, to report on the neighborhood and ask about mine. I told her about the sign. She said it was about time. I agreed with her. Outside, the Fresno evening was settling in around the workshop, and the new sign and the persimmon tree in Ray's backyard, which by April had leaves on it small and green, and entirely committed to the season, and I stood at the kitchen window and looked at it for a while before I went in to help Ray with dinner. I did not enjoy watching Savannah struggle. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this story where the man who was wronged takes some satisfaction in watching the people who wronged him face consequences. And I have tried to examine myself honestly on that point, and I do not think that version is mine. What I felt when Kyle told me things, and when Savannah told me things herself in the brief phone calls that had become a quiet, irregular rhythm between us, was something closer to sorrow than satisfaction. The kind of sorrow that comes not from wanting things to be worse for someone, but from wishing they had not needed to be this way at all. Kyle told me about the apartment first. Savannah and Diane moved into a 2-bedroom unit on the south side of Bakersfield at the beginning of February, 1 week after the January deadline. The unit was on the second floor of a complex that had a broken gate at the entrance and a laundry room that required quarters and was frequently occupied by someone else's clothes. Kyle had helped them carry boxes up the stairs on moving day because Brandon had asked him to, and Kyle, being Kyle, had said yes, without being asked twice, which was the thing about Kyle that made him the kind of friend worth having. He told me the unit was clean, but small, that the kitchen had a window that faced another building's wall, that Diane had arranged what furniture they had with the particular care of a woman who was going to make the best of something, whether it deserved the effort or not. He said Savannah had carried boxes without talking much, which was not her usual way, and that at one point she had set a box down in the middle of the living room and stood there looking at it for a long moment before picking it up again and carrying it to where it needed to go. He said he did not know what she was thinking in that moment. I thought I probably did. Savannah started working at a restaurant called Delaney's on Oak Street in the middle of February, a casual American place that did lunch and dinner service and needed someone who could be on her feet for 6 hours without complaint. She had waited tables once in college for a single semester and had not done it since. She told me later that the first week her feet hurt, in a way she had not known feet could hurt, a deep structural ache that started at the heel and worked upward, and that she had come home after her first double shift and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her shoes for a long time. She said she thought about my shoes. The ones I wore to jobs, the steel-toed boots that she had made a comment about once at a family gathering, something about how they looked like something from a different century. She had said it in the offhand way that people said things they did not fully mean, but also did not fully not mean, the kind of comment that floated just below the threshold of something requiring a response. I had not responded. I had looked at her for a moment, and then looked away, which was my way of declining an argument I had not started. She told me she thought about that comment every time she laced up the non-slip shoes. The restaurant required the ugly practical ones that left marks on the back of her ankles for the first month until her skin toughened up. She said she did not tell me this to perform guilt. She told me because it was true, and because she had decided somewhere in those weeks that telling the truth was the only currency she had left that was worth anything. Brandon filed for legal separation in March. He had found an apartment near his mother's place in the northeast part of the city and was working his regular shifts at the Amazon fulfillment center, and according to Kyle, doing all right in the low-grade, one-day-at-a-time way that people did all right when they were managing something they had not expected to be managing. Kyle said Brandon did not talk about Savannah much, but when he did, it was not with anger, which Kyle thought was either a good sign or a bad one, depending on what came next. Savannah told me about the separation herself in a phone call on a Sunday afternoon in late March. She said it plainly, without the fractured quality her voice had carried in January, and I understood that she had been sitting with the fact of it long enough that the initial shock had settled into something she was learning to carry. "Are you doing okay?" I asked. "Not really," she said, "but I'm doing." That was, I thought, an honest answer, and honesty from Savannah was still new enough to feel significant. Diane had gone back to her receptionist positions at the dental office, the same job she had held for 11 years, which had been held for her while everything else came apart, which was either luck or the particular reward of 11 years of reliable attendance. She and Savannah lived together in the apartment with the wall-facing kitchen window and the laundry room that required quarters, and by all accounts they had developed between them the careful, slightly formal courtesy of two people who loved each other and had also recently discovered the limits of what that love could cover for. In May, a letter arrived at Ray's address with Diane's return address, written in the upper left corner of the envelope in the careful, slightly forward-leaning handwriting she used for things she considered important. Ray brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the kitchen table without comment, and went back outside. I looked at the envelope for a long time before I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, which meant more than one page. The flap was sealed with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she had licked it and then pressed it down and then pressed it down again. I carried it to the table and sat down and held it in both hands. Then I set it down and went to help Ray with what he was working on, because I was not ready yet, and I had learned in the past several months that not being ready yet was a legitimate position that did not require apology or acceleration. The letter would be there when I came back. It had already waited long enough that a few more hours would not change what it said. I came back to it after dinner. Ray had gone to bed. The kitchen was quiet and the evening light through the window had gone from gold to gray, and I sat at the table with the letter in front of me and opened it. It was 4 pages. Her handwriting threw out no corrections, which meant she had written it more than once before she wrote the version she sent. The first sentence said, "I have been trying to write this for 3 months, and every version sounded like I was explaining myself rather than telling you the truth, so I am starting over one more time." I read it through once. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the kitchen counter where I would see it in the morning. I was not ready to know what I was going to do with it yet, but I was glad she had sent it. She did not call ahead. I found out later when she told me herself that she had thought about calling. She had picked up her phone 3 separate times during the 2-hour drive from Bakersfield to Fresno and set it back down each time without dialing, because she was afraid that if she called I would tell her not to come, and she was not sure she could absorb that particular answer on that particular day. So she drove instead, which was the braver choice and the more honest one because it did not allow for the intermediate step of being turned away before she arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon in August, the kind of August afternoon that Fresno did without apology, the heat sitting on the valley floor like something that had decided to stay. I had been in the shop since 7 that morning, which was my usual start, working through a job order for a commercial property on the north side of the city that needed its electrical panel updated to current code. The work was detailed and satisfying in the way that detailed work was satisfying, the kind that required your full attention and rewarded it with something visible and correct at the end of the day. Ray had been in the workshop next door. I could hear his table saw through the shared wall, the familiar rhythm of it, the sound that had become as much a part of my mornings in Fresno as the percolator coffee and the east light through the shop window. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the saw stopped. This was not unusual. Ray stopped frequently to measure or to change a blade or simply to think. But a few moments after the saw went quiet, I heard his workshop door open and close, and then nothing for a minute, and then a knock on the wall between our spaces that we had established as the signal for something worth coming out for. I set down the wire stripper I was holding and went to the front of the shop. She was standing on the sidewalk outside the glass door. She had not come in yet. I could see her through the glass standing in the August heat, in a pale blue dress I did not recognize, her hair pulled back, one hand holding a white bakery box by the string, and the other hand at her side slightly open the way hands looked when their owner was not sure what to do with them. She was looking at the sign above the door. Hayes Electrical, Fresno. I stood inside the glass for a moment and looked at her hooksing at the sign. She had not seen me yet. Ray was somewhere behind me. I could feel his presence without turning around, and he did not say anything, which was the right call. Savannah had lost some weight since Christmas. Her face was thinner, and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there 8 months ago, or that I had not noticed 8 months ago, which might have amounted to the same thing. She was wearing sensible shoes, the kind with thick soles and good support, the kind you wore when you spent 6 hours a day on your feet. They were not the shoes she would have worn a year ago. A year ago, she had worn shoes that were about being seen. These were shoes that were about getting through the day. She looked tired in a way that was not unattractive. It was the tiredness of someone who had been doing hard things and had not stopped doing them. I pushed open the glass door. The heat came in immediately, the heavy August heat of the Central Valley, and Savannah turned at the sound of the door, and we stood there on either side of the threshold, looking at each other. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright and dry. She had made a decision before she got out of the car about what she was and was not going to do, and she was holding to it. She lifted the bakery box slightly. "I didn't know what to bring," she said. Her voice was steady, which I could tell cost her something. "I just remembered you liked these." I looked at the box. White cardboard, red string, the Kern's Bakery logo printed in the corner. Kern's had been on California Avenue for 40 years and made a cinnamon roll that I had been buying on Sunday mornings since before Savannah could remember. I had brought them home dozens of times over the years, setting the box on the kitchen counter on Sunday mornings while Diane was still asleep. And Savannah, as a small child, had learned the sound of that particular box being set down and had appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with the reliable accuracy of someone who had developed a sense for things worth waking up for. I had not thought about those Sunday mornings in a long time. I was thinking about them now. "You remembered," I said. She nodded. "I've been trying to remember more things." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable exactly. The pause of two people who had a great deal to say and were deciding where to begin, or whether beginning right now at the threshold was the right geography for it. I looked at her face. The thinness, the lines, the shoes. "You look tired," I said. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, in the way that expressions shifted when they encountered something unexpected and true. Her chin did the thing it had always done, the slight upward movement that in the past had meant she was bracing for an argument. This time it was different. This time it was the chin of someone trying not to cry, which was a different thing entirely and required more effort. "I am," she said. I had thought about this moment. Not obsessively, not with any particular plan, but in the way you thought about things that you knew were coming at some uncertain point in the future. I had thought about what I would say, whether I would say much at all, whether I would be able to look at her and feel anything other than the complicated amalgam of things that Christmas Eve had left in me. What I felt standing in the doorway of my shop on a Tuesday afternoon in August, with the heat pressing in from outside, and Savannah standing on the sidewalk with a white bakery box and tired eyes and shoes that were about getting through the day, was not simple. It was not forgiveness exactly, not yet, not in any complete or finished sense. It was something more preliminary than that. The feeling of a door that had been closed for 8 months, standing open for the first time, not swung wide, just open enough to let the air move through. I stepped to the side and held the door. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." She crossed the threshold. This time nobody stopped her. I let the door fall shut behind us. The heat stayed outside. The shop was cool and smelled of solder and sawdust from the adjoining wall, and the particular neutral smell of electrical work, which was the smell of my working life and had been for 30 years. Savannah stood just inside the door and looked around the space with an expression I could not fully read, and then she set the bakery box down on the corner of the workbench with a care that suggested she understood it was a gesture and wanted it received as one. Ray appeared in the doorway between the shop and the workshop, looked at the two of us and said, "I'm going to get some lunch." Then he was gone, the workshop door closing quietly behind him. I went to the coffee maker on the small shelf above the desk. It was a plain machine, a 12-cup drip model that I had bought at the hardware store when I set up the shop. Nothing remarkable about it. I filled it and turned it on and listened to it begin to do its work. Savannah stood at the workbench. Her hand rested on the edge of it. She was looking at the tools racked along the wall above the bench, the organized rows of them, each one in its place. "You always kept them so organized," she said quietly. "Easier to find," I said. She nodded slowly. The coffee maker began to produce the first sounds of something brewing. Outside through the shop window, the August afternoon went on doing what August afternoons in the Central Valley did, unhurried and absolute. Inside, the two of us stood in the cool room and waited for the coffee, which was perhaps the most ordinary thing two people could do together, and which was for exactly that reason the right place to start. We didn't talk about Christmas. We didn't talk about the house, the contract, the card, or Gary Cole. We talked about smaller things, the kind people talk about, when the large things are still too large to approach directly. The coffee was ready. I poured 2 mugs and set one on the workbench. Savannah picked it up with both hands, the way she always had since she was a teenager, wrapping her palms around it, like she was cold even when she wasn't. I had forgotten that about her. It came back without effort, the way small, true things came back when you stopped bracing against them. She told me about Delaney's. The regulars, the retired couple every Tuesday, the contractor who tipped in exact amounts. She told it without complaint, which was new with the attention of someone who had learned to look at people in front of her, because looking away was no longer something she could afford. I told her about the east window in the shop and Ray's percolator coffee. She said it had always tasted like it was made by someone who did not care what you thought about it. I laughed. First time since before Christmas. It arrived without warning, which was how I knew it was real. She smiled back, smaller and less certain than before, and considerably more honest. After a while, she set her mug down and looked at her hands. Nail polish chipped on 2 fingers. A year ago, that would not have happened. A year ago, her nails had been a point of pride. Now they were the nails of someone who washed dishes after double shifts and had stopped thinking about it. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "I know that." "I know you do," I said. She nodded once, like we had agreed on something. "The gutters you replaced. The furnace that winter. The gas tank you always filled on my car." She paused. "I never once asked myself where full gas tanks came from." "You were young," I said. I was old enough, she said. She was right, so I didn't argue. I went to the filing cabinet and came back with a small envelope. I set it on the workbench in front of her. Storage unit on Elm Street, I said. Your things from the house. Boxes from your old room. The wooden train set you painted in 5th grade. I paused. Your grandmother's quilt. Her breath caught. She had not known I had kept the quilt. You kept it, she said. Whenever you're ready, Fuss, I said. She put the envelope carefully in her pocket. Before she left, she stopped at the door and turned back. Walter. Her voice held the same fracture as January, but underneath it something different now, less desperate, more deliberate. Thank you. For the coffee. For the storage unit. For opening the door. I looked at her for a moment. 23 years from the 6-year-old on the curb in the too small jacket to the woman standing here with chipped nails and tired eyes and a small envelope in her pocket. You're welcome, I said. Ray came back with 2 cold Coca-Colas. He handed me one and stood beside me at the window. She seemed different, he said. She did, I said. The August light had gone fully golden across the workbench and the tool rack and the sign above the door. Hayes Electrical. Fresno. That was enough. For the first time in longer than I could remember, enough was exactly what it was. If this grandpa story taught me anything, it is this: kindness given without boundaries is not virtue. It is a slow disappearance. I spent 20 years making myself easy to overlook. I told myself that patience was love. Maybe it was. But patience without a voice is not love, it is permission. I should have spoken sooner. I should have stood in my own doorway years before Christmas Eve forced me to. Do not wait for the moment that breaks everything to say what you deserve. That is the one lesson I wish I had learned before I needed it. I believe God puts people in your life to show you where you have been standing wrong. Pastor Glenn, Dorothy, Ray, even Savannah in the end. Every one of them handed me something true when I needed it most. If you have stayed quiet too long inside your own family story, I hope something in this grandpa story gives you the courage to speak before the door closes on its own. This has been one man's family story. If it stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read every one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A small note. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for reflection and understanding. If that is not for you, that is perfectly fine. Choose what serves you best.